Welcome everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. We invite you to connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, follow us at Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow us at Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, follow us at Campaign for GLR as well. Please use hashtag GLR Reading and hashtag Learning Tuesdays to share any thoughts you may have from this session. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez. I'll be primarily behind the scenes helping with this conversation. I did want to show all of you some housekeeping tips before we get started relating to the chat box and the Q&A box where we'll ask you to post any questions you may have. And did want to share that we'll be producing all resources and the link to the recording later this week. Additionally, we'll have a brief poll right towards the end of the conversation that we would love for you to respond to. We would like to invite you to join us for some other upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Next week on September 20th, we have an exciting doubleheader, starting with a funder to funder conversation co-sponsored by the Overdeck Family Foundation on re-envisioning school staffing at 12:30 p.m. At 3 p.m. that same day, we'll have parent-teacher home visits and the power of trusting relationships, 25 years of impact. And the following week, September 27th, another exciting doubleheader, this time starting off with a peer exchange on deepening school community collaboration to support children and families, followed by a conversation on learning from the bright spots, examining student achievement data during COVID-19. Registration and more information will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope you can join us. Joining you now is Hilary Jones, Education Specialist with Foundations, Inc. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for joining us today to look at these policy efforts that are advancing the science of reading in classrooms across the country. There's a growing body of research on the science of reading that's paired with this reporting on how science is not being applied in many classrooms. And this has really led to increasing attention and a profound shift in the training of educators and approaches to reading instruction. And to support those educators in responding to this work and to this evidence, organizers and advocates are working with state leaders to enact legislation. Our panelists today are going to take some time to discuss how this conversation came to the forefront, the current state of reading instruction, work they have done to promote state level policies, and to advocate for state and local implementation, as well as barriers they are facing to advance the science of reading. I'm honored to introduce our moderator today, Charlene Russell Tucker, the Commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Education. Charlene was appointed by Governor Ned Lamont as Commissioner for the Connecticut State Department of Education in August of 2021. And she's a performance-driven and visionary educational leader with over 20 years of experience in successfully leveraging the interconnectedness of the social, emotional, physical, and mental health of students and their families as foundations for positive school and life outcomes. She passionately supports family and community engagement in education and has successfully led school attendance and school discipline initiatives with attentive focus on equity and diversity. And so, Charlene, thank you for being with us today and leading this conversation.
Hilary, thank you very much. And my thanks to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for facilitating these Learning Tuesdays, and welcome to all our participants. It is a pleasure to be here along with our distinguished panel today, who I have the pleasure of introducing. Dr. Kimona Burke from Excel in Ed, who works to support state leaders in building new or improving existing K-3 reading policies. Todd Collins is the organizer of the California Reading Coalition, a movement of educators, advocates, parents, and policymakers committed to improving reading instruction and outcomes for California's 6 million students. Patrick Lyons is a senior policy specialist with the National Conference of State Legislators, who manages early education work for the conference and is a liaison to the Michigan State Legislature. Dr. Tanji Reed Marshall leads the Education Trust work and equity in P12 practice, having worked both in the classroom and as a trainer of educators. Emily Anford is our final panelist and will open this session. Emily is a senior correspondent and producer for American Public Media, covering education for more than a decade. For the past 4 years, Emily has spent the majority of her time reporting on early reading instruction, including a 2018 podcast and an article that sent shockwaves across the US and highlighted the importance of teacher knowledge of the science of reading. We will begin our discussion today by looking at what has occurred with the landscape of science of reading legislation across the country and challenges that are faced in this work today. I am pleased to say Connecticut's commitment to early literacy is a long and storied past in this space as well, so I'm honored to moderate today's conversation. Emily, the National Reading Panel Report was released in 2000, but it was your reporting nearly 2 decades later that really brought attention to the discrepancies between the research, the science of reading, and what was actually happening in classrooms across the US. What did you see when you began reporting on this issue? And what progress have you seen since then? Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, no one was more surprised than I was that this work has had the impact that it's had, not something I was expecting. I didn't really know anything about this when I got interested in this topic really 5, close to 6 years ago at this point. And I think most people do, but not all, but most people in education know about the National Reading Panel and know that there was this big effort about 20 years ago to align instruction with the science of reading. And I think that a lot of people know that there are these 5 key components of reading instruction. I think a lot of teachers can name them off: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. So I think what happened after the National Reading Panel is there was an understanding of these sort of different components of reading, but I don't know that a lot of teachers really got the understanding that they needed, or educators generally, really about how children learn to read and how those different components work together. So I think in a really, really big picture way, what happened is that people sort of checked off the box as long as you did a little bit of all of those things. The idea was that it was going to add up to kids learning how to read. And the thing that we had been fighting about, actually, we've been fighting about for centuries in this country, is phonics. So that ended up being the thing that people sort of fought the most about. And in some ways, the National Reading Panel kind of settled the debate. There was a lot of research that said phonics instruction is really important. And so a lot of people added a little bit of that. And so people added some phonics instruction, maybe without understanding why phonics instruction is important and sort of how that contributes to how a person learns how to read. And then I think the most important thing is that people didn't take away something else that was very present in reading instruction, and it's been there since the days of whole language. And that is this idea that sounding out a word is one way to know what it is, but you don't have to know how to do that because there are all these other strategies you can use to figure out a word. So kids were taught these other strategies. And I think the importance of phonics, the linking of teaching kids how to sound out written words and then letting them practice in books with words that they've been taught how to read, some of that got lost in the shuffle. And I think when my reporting came along, I just pointed out some of those key things. And it had an impact because it was ready to have an impact, because there was a huge amount of research that had already happened. There were researchers all over the country who were very concerned about this. And there were a lot of parents and teachers who were very concerned about this too, and who knew that there was a real disconnect between what we know about what kids need to learn to be good readers and what was happening in schools. And the fact that there was just a foundation of these people who were concerned and active, I just think it speaks to the power of what journalism can do and why journalism is important. I think I came along and simply explained some things that opened some people's eyes and allowed other people to point and say, look, that's what I've been talking about for 2 decades. So I think that's what happened.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. And that's a perfect setting for perfect timing is really what you talked about for this movement. And so Emily shared a little bit about the movement around the science of reading in recent years. Now I would like to go deeper to understand, that was really great table setting for us, to dig deeper into the policy landscape of that progress. So I'm inviting Patrick Lyons to share with us. Patrick is a senior policy specialist with the National Conference of State Legislatures, Patrick manages early education work for the conference, including conducting and directing research, providing technical assistance to legislators and legislative staff, and facilitating working groups focused on early education policy. So Patrick, given what was just said, what Emily mentioned to us and kind of the table setting, can you provide us with a 30,000-foot view of what you are seeing across the states with relation to evidence-based reading instruction, teacher training programs, student retention, and other high-level issues? Welcome.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think it's fitting that we're going from a professional journalist to a reformed journalist, now policy wonk. So really excited to talk about, as you mentioned, a little bit about what states have been doing on the science of reading over the last really year is where I looked at. That doesn't mean that legislators haven't been doing things on this topic for quite a while, but I wanted to look at, in the context of what's happened over the last few years, where are legislators really focusing their efforts and interventions in this space. I will say I'm not going to go very deep onto any of these individual bills. I can share resources afterwards, or I would encourage you to look at NCSL's dashboard, where we track and summarize every bit of legislation introduced across the country, whether it passes or not. But today I'm going to talk about bills that have passed over the past year or so. And I kind of divided them into some broad trends that I would say we're seeing. I think the first is you're seeing a number of bills around professional development and licensing, ensuring that the science of reading is part of that. States are looking at changing the curriculum requirements and how they assess early readers in their progress in that space. There's been some work for special needs students. There's been work to make sure that we can just get physical books in the hands of kids. And then there's been some states that have done a more comprehensive bill in the last year or so. And by that, I mean, it probably hits on some of those topics that I just talked about. So professional development and licensing is pretty straightforward. Basically, I can go straight to Oklahoma. They have done a new Teacher Preparation Act. In this, they are requiring a multi-tiered system of support for their pre-service teaching programs, including things on behavioral health, but really focused on the science of literacy, instruction, and as well as math. There's a bill from Arizona that does something similar. There's legislation in Virginia. And one thing that I will say about the legislation in Virginia that's different is they are really having a hands-on view of working with their education prep programs to ensure that the science of reading is part of the curriculum. And so they are also putting together a commission of independent experts and stakeholders to kind of define what does science-based reading research and what is the evidence that we are going to use to define it here in our state. And so they're going to work over the next few years to put that together and be auditing their education prep programs on a 7-year basis. And then one kind of smaller move that I think is also getting at this topic is in Wisconsin. Wisconsin has now adopted that to be a licensed teacher in their state, especially to teach these younger grades, K to 5, you must have passed the Foundations of Reading test. That is part of actually the Massachusetts test for educator licensure. So they're taking work done in another state and bringing it to their state. So that is a kind of low lift, but gets at trying to make sure the teachers are well versed in this. As far as curriculum and assessments, this is kind of relates to what we just saw, but I'd point to Kansas, the Kansas House bill, the Every Child Can Read Act. This puts a requirement on local school districts to develop some educational interventions related to literacy, make sure that those are based in the science of reading. And make sure it is multi-tiered. So it includes things like one-on-one instruction, small group instruction, tutoring, or even summer school opportunities. So that's in Kansas, just trying to get a cohesive view and a cohesive plan in every different district on working towards the science of reading. As I mentioned, there's a number of states that are looking at interventions for special needs students. And I'm so glad that Abraham and Judy are here today to be our ASL interpreters. So both Iowa and Virginia have bills that have passed to focus on language and literacy development for students who are deaf. And so this is really trying to create resources for districts on this, to create resources for families, just to think about how to reach these students, because we do see often significant literacy gaps between these populations. There's also a similar move for dyslexia. This is actually something that is not just in the past year. I can say I've been seeing this for multiple years, but this is states putting together handbooks on dyslexia, right? Resources for districts on how to assess children, how to then help kids who are, diagnosed with dyslexia to excel in reading. And we can look at New York, who's putting together a task force, or Oklahoma, who is trying to update and maintain their dyslexia handbook. Really quickly, this is straightforward, but the importance can't be underscored enough, is just getting books in the hands of kids. Maryland has their Young Readers program that not only establishes a book mail program in the city of Baltimore, but also a matching grant program for the entire state, in which districts can receive matching funds from the state to engage with a third-party nonprofit who's providing books by mail for students. Louisiana also has a similar model that just passed as well. And then lastly, we can talk a little bit about some of these comprehensive bills. And what I mean there again is just doing a number of things in one piece of legislation. So Vermont, they recently passed their Improving Pre-Kindergarten through Grade 12 Literacy. So by the name, it's comprehensive. But really, this is about developing, some of the factors in this are developing a professional development learning module for teachers, making sure that that's based specifically in this legislation. It says make sure it's based on the National Reading Panel, which we heard about. They are also creating an advisory council on literacy, which will advise the Department of Ed, the State Board of Education, and the General Assembly on how to improve outcomes for students. And they are also working with their standards board for professional educators to understand how to incorporate some of these things into their literacy programs, or into their literacy programs and their licensing requirements. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about one more piece of legislation. I'll talk about Utah. Early Learning Outcomes Improvement is a Utah Senate bill that I'll talk about here. So this is, again, another comprehensive bill that tries to do a number of things. The first thing is, of course, developing a literacy coaching program for teachers and professional development programs for teachers. They are also creating a panel of experts in the science of reading to help advise both the executive and legislative branch as they move forward on implementation. They have a goal here to partner with private business and nonprofit. I think specifically they're talking about getting books in the hands of students through these methods, and leveraging community engagement and literacy, and also setting forth some standard diagnostic tools across the state. That's actually something that I should have mentioned earlier. Most of these states that are looking at curriculum are also moving forward with at least state approved, if not state designed, assessment tools that they're requiring states to use. Lastly, on this Utah bill, I'll just talk about the Student Success Grant Program, which again is challenging locals to develop a reading curriculum and intervention program that meets a number of standards based on the science of reading, but also challenges the university system to incorporate more and more of that into their work, and making sure that as administrators as well at the elementary level are able to pass a literacy preparation assessment. I think that is the really quick, really high level view of what's going on out there. I'm just kind of skimming my notes to see if there's any kind of interventions that I didn't note. There's things on here. Virginia is requiring a reading specialist be hired for every 500 students in kindergarten through third grade throughout the school, and providing funding to make sure that happens. Their bill also requires that people in teacher prep programs get a lot of hands-on work with the science of reading. So of course, that is the rundown of some policy levers that folks are pulling on in terms of early literacy, but I'm certainly open to answer any questions you might have, and certainly happy to connect and follow up with more specifics on what is exactly in these bills and who are some of the players involved.
Well, Patrick, thank you. It is clear that this is a sense of urgency across many, many states. I would say probably across the country. So thank you for providing that kind of overall national perspective. And I'm sure that our participants are probably quickly even taking some notes to figure out where they can look to, either about policy or just other things that's going on. So thank you for sharing that information with us. We're moving on in our panel, and you'll see how this is building on each other. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Burke, who is a senior policy fellow in early literacy at Excelling Ed. In this role, she supports states pursuing a comprehensive approach to K-3 reading policy by assisting state leaders in building new or improving existing K-3 reading policies with a heavy focus on supporting successful policy implementation. We know that that is key. She was previously the State Literacy Director at the Mississippi Department of Education, where she led the implementation of Mississippi's Literacy-Based Promotion Act. Dr. Burke, at Excelling Ed, you have supported at least 9 states alone this year that passed or improved Ready by 3 legislation. Can you share more about this work and what the policies address?
Good
Welcome.
afternoon. Thank you. Thank you so much. I do have some slides that are going to be shared during my presentation today. And I think someone's going to share the screen for my slides to come up. But as they are getting ready to do that, yes, at Excelling Ed, we consider ourselves a think tank and a do tank. So we're a policy advocacy organization, and we work directly with policymakers who are drafting bills that are focused on early literacy legislation. But then the other part of my work is to then work with state education agency literacy leaders on the implementation side of the literacy legislation. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to talk briefly about why now? Early literacy policy. So why now? Why is there a focus? And I really love the fact that we begin with Emily, because I believe that her reporting on the science of reading really got folks to thinking about, or having this conversation around our kitchen tables. A lot of times, especially coming from a state agency or coming from the district level administration, we have these conversations around conference tables, right? And we talk about the best approaches to teaching children how to read. But now this conversation through Emily's reporting really caused like a science of reading resurgence. And we've had this information, this research for years, for decades, and especially with the National Reading Panel report. But with this reporting, parents, community members, other stakeholders were able to listen to this and be able to connect it to real life and their everyday experiences with their children, for teachers with their students, and to really understand the importance of ensuring that students were being taught to read with this science of reading based approach. What also is a force behind early literacy policy momentum across the country is our NAEP 4th grade reading data. In 2019, we saw that about 35% of our 4th grade students were reading at or above NAEP proficient. As we know, recently, the NAEP released trend data for 9-year-olds, which showed, of course, dramatic losses, right, after, especially after COVID-19. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, there were schools that were shut down, but a lot of us in policy and advocacy work, we were really working really hard during those times, because there were states, the state boards of education, the legislators who were saying, we understand that when we come out of this, that we are going to have some solutions to address this unprecedented learning loss that we know our students are going to have when they return back to our brick and mortar school buildings. So the pandemic, of course, played a role in that. And then lastly, dyslexia focused reform. Patrick mentioned earlier about some of the states that are adopting dyslexia legislation. Senator Cassidy from Louisiana is really championing the 21st Century Dyslexia Act to ensure that dyslexia has its own designation under IDEA and not just lumped under the specific learning disabilities. So all of these things together, I believe, have made for, I always kind of call it like the perfect storm, to where there's now this national focus on this one big, very, very important issue of literacy and illiteracy in our country. Next slide. So when we talk about a comprehensive early literacy policy at Excelling Ed, we consider about 15 or so policy fundamental principles. Retention and intensive intervention have a few more things underneath. And I know you're thinking, okay, well, she said 15, right? So when we think about a policy being comprehensive, we're looking at ways in which this policy supports teachers. It supports teachers, it supports our educators, our teachers and administrators, and of course it supports our parents and families. So supports for teachers and policy may include the science of reading training, ensuring that there are reading coaches who are in the schools to assist teachers from transferring all of that learning, that theory, actually into practice. Also including an alignment of educator preparation program coursework and assessments for certification, such as the Foundations of Reading Assessment, and of course, funding. You know, we do have some unfunded mandates across the country where they are being required to ensure that students are reading by the end of 3rd grade, but there's not funding or adequate funding that may be allocated to ensure that our schools and districts are able to meet this goal. The next piece would include assessment and parent notification, ensuring that all students are screened at least 3 times per year to establish a baseline, of course, to progress monitor, and is including screening for characteristics of dyslexia. Sally Shaywitz always says, you know, you really can't be counted if you're not identified. So we have to make sure that we're identifying our students early to ensure that they're receiving the supports and interventions that they need. Also including parents at the very beginning, notifying parents early and often if their child has been identified with a reading deficiency, so that they can be our partners in this work. We have to ensure that our parents and families are our partners in this work. We need them to support us in these efforts. And there are things that parents and families can do at home as an extension of what we are teaching children in school. Next, instruction and intervention, which includes your adoption of the high quality instructional materials aligned to the science, individual reading plans for students, interventions, progress monitoring, opportunities for summer reading camps, and then also, again, parent resources. And last but not least, there are states that have adopted a promotion retention component of their law that includes a different year of 3rd grade. When we think about, okay, if a child is going to be retained in 3rd grade because he or she does not meet the criteria for promotion to 4th grade, or they don't meet one of the good cause exemptions for promotion to 4th grade, how can we ensure that the retention year is not the same year that they had before, that this year includes more intensive interventions and more opportunities for students to receive the support that they need? Next slide. So I'm showing this map, and with this map, there are different shades of the degree to which states have adopted these principles, all these principles that I mentioned on the previous slide. This year alone, as was mentioned in the introduction, there were about 9 states that adopted new comprehensive policies that included all the things on the slide. And then there are some states that strengthened their policies. Alaska was a really big win for our Foundation for Excelling Ed, because we have been working with Alaska for the last 10 years to pass a law. Alaska was 51st in the country for 4th grade reading. And this year we were able to get it done with Alaska, and of course with the partners on the ground there. Other states such as Delaware signed 2 laws, one that did include progress monitoring curricula, you know, the other with professional development. And Pennsylvania, what's unique about Pennsylvania is that they passed a law related to science of reading professional development, identification of students, and of course, differentiated instruction and teachers being able to address students' needs. But this is an opt-in for Pennsylvania. You know, it's, you know, let's go with the willing for those schools and school districts that want to begin to opt in for this type of professional development, and hopefully then moving out to other schools and districts to ensure that there is this strategic and consistent approach to improving teacher knowledge. So I'll say this, as you look at this map and as you look at the 2022 and all of the things that have happened this year and of course in previous years, it's one thing to adopt these principles. It's one thing to put these things into law, but it's a completely different thing. And again, adopting a policy is a great first step. I always say a literacy law is an equity law, but the next step is to ensure that these requirements that are included in the law are implemented effectively, and that there's the structure that's there at the Department of Education, that there's the guidance that the department is giving to all of the stakeholders and those who are going to be responsible for implementing these things on the ground. So we have to make sure that we are really investing in the implementation of these things. And we can celebrate when these laws are passed, but then that's when the work happens. We have to make sure that everyone who's responsible for implementing these laws are supported and are getting what they need. All right, next slide. So what does it take? It takes an interconnected system from policy to practice. Of course, it takes our state legislators. It also takes our Department of Education and our colleges of education. In our colleges of education, they have to begin to see themselves in K-12 student outcomes. Their reach does not end once candidates cross the stage. That impact lasts forever. As long as that candidate becomes a teacher and has children in front of him or her, that impact of how well they were taught to teach children really lasts forever. But then we also have to have our district superintendents and leaders, our school administrators, and of course, our teachers who are going to be responsible for that practice. And I'm going to leave you with some things about what states are facing at this time. They're really facing questions around implementation as it relates to how do they balance local control. I know some of you may be thinking about that. Okay, this is a state law, we have local control. How are they going to balance local control with the requirements of the law? How can you leverage external partners? We were able to do that here in Mississippi with the Barksdale Reading Institute and others. And then also, how can we assure that the Department of Education has the capacity, the infrastructure, all of those things to be able to facilitate and lead this work. So thank you so much for having me, and I will be answering questions in the Q&A box during the session. Thank you.
So Dr. Burke, thank you so much for all that information that you shared. And this is when it's not right to have to be the moderator, because I've got to move us along instead of jumping in the conversation as well. But you said so much that is so important that we talk about the family, the school, the community, the legislature. I love the animated graphic when we saw the gears actually working together, because that's really what it takes. So thank you very much. And I know you'll be here for Q&A, so we'll come back to you. But at this time, I'd also like to introduce our two remaining panelists, Todd Collins and Dr. Marshall. Todd Collins is an organizer of the California Reading Coalition, a movement of educators, advocates, parents, and policymakers committed to improving reading instruction and outcomes for California's 6 million students. He's also a school board member in Palo Alto, California. And we'll also be hearing from Dr. Marshall, who is the director of P12 Practice, leading EdTrust Equity in Motion assignment analysis work. And prior to joining EdTrust, she held a wide range of positions related to literacy instruction, including working in the Office of Academic Programs of Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University to prepare the School of Education's accreditation with the Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation, working for a district as well as a district level literacy specialist in North Carolina, where she supported middle schools across the district to refine their literacy practices, and working in schools to improve literacy instruction in several states with an emphasis in traditionally underserved students. Starting with Todd, can you share what you're seeing at the state level in California? Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And boy, what a great panel this has been so far. First, I just want to say that I really appreciated what Kimiana said earlier about how policy is only as good as its implementation. That's so true. And I always point to Mississippi, where she led the implementation of the state literacy program as a state that really showed how it should be done. And that's something, as I'll mention in a second, we're really starting to think about in California. California has been a balanced literacy state for a long time, and we still are. While we have a strong emphasis on local control in education, in fact, a large majority of our schools teach reading in very similar ways. In a report we have coming out next month called the California Reading Curriculum Report, it shows that 90% of all California districts, 90%, use just one of 4 programs, Benchmark, Wonders, Journeys, and Lucy Calkins, which are all mainstream balanced literacy programs from major publishers. So less than 2% of districts, about 5 districts total that we know of out of 1,000 statewide, are using any of the science of reading aligned or knowledge building programs that are becoming popular in other parts of the country. So that said, there are a few districts that have discovered science of reading approaches on their own, and one really notable one is Los Angeles Unified, which is by far the largest district in our state and the second largest in the country. Without a lot of fanfare, they've adopted a science of reading approach over the last 3 years, and now are training over 1,000 teachers a year in science of reading concepts. They're also one of the first districts in California to widely adopt a knowledge-oriented reading curriculum, in their case, CKLA. So it can be done in California, and they are doing it. But I'd say at a state level, we are still just getting started. Our state leaders are just beginning to talk about our serious statewide reading problem and the need for state level action to address it. On Kimiona's map that she showed earlier, we were shaded gray, which if I read the map right, means that we are on the real laggards among the states. Fortunately, we are starting to look at states like Mississippi and Tennessee and Colorado as examples we can learn from about what an effective comprehensive state program might look like. And in fact, I'm really happy to report that Kimiona, who we just heard from, has been publicly called out by our state education leaders as someone that they really think can help us in this area. So I hope that means that Kimiona will come and visit us soon. So the bottom line is that, while this is in many places in the country, I mean, Mississippi passed its Literary-Based Promotion Act, I think in 2013, so almost 10 years ago. California, on the other hand, is really just getting started. We're just starting to talk about state level action. And that's frankly why our organization exists, to try to promote that, and why we hold our California Reading Summit every year, which takes place in a few weeks. And anybody listening, especially folks from California, can join that summit. It's all virtual and it's free. And you can find out about that at our website, careads.org. So that's what's going on in California.
So Todd, thank you so much. It's always great to hear what's going on in individual states. I know we've got the wide view earlier from Patrick, but it's great to hear what's happening there. I can also just quickly share before we hear from Dr. Marshall, that in Connecticut, we conducted our state assessment in 2021 and also in 21-22. And we just recently released our assessment scores a few weeks ago, because we actually believe that it is very important that while we look nationwide, you've heard about the NAEP scores or NAEP information that was released, that we need to also take a close look at what's happening in individual states. And so for full transparency, for support and accountability to engage the entire school community that you've heard Dr. Burke talked about, we developed a recovery dashboard to show a change in performance from 2018-19 to where we are today. And we did that because we firmly believe it's important that families, community partners, and others know and understand, so that we can have constructive dialogue about moving forward. And so what we saw, while student achievement still lags pre-pandemic levels, that we do see signs of learning acceleration and recovery. And so we've been intentionally using this information along with other key data points, such as attendance, to get the entire education ecosystem together to say that there's work that needs to be done, and together that we can do it well. In Connecticut, our theme for this year is "The sky is not the limit." And so the goal is so everyone can work together for the sake of our students. And this is an area of major concern. So Dr. Marshall, great ideas abound, evidence-based practices. And as we've heard, it's not just a policy, but it's about being able to implement effectively. But we know policies are also critically important. And so in that conversation, before we begin our discussion, Dr. Marshall, can you provide us some perspective and what you believe should be included in state policies? Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to sit back and take a lot of copious notes in my notebook. So this has been terrific. I think what should be included is what Dr. Burke shared with us. There's a comprehensive way to think about what does it mean to create the conditions. And I think that's what we need to understand about the laws. The laws are condition creators around how to set the stage for every child in a state to learn how to read. That's one thing. I think the other thing that we have to do before we even get to the laws is how do we help our legislators understand what they're actually writing laws to do? And we heard Emily talk about it. They sort of focus on very small areas of what they hear. And one of the things that we have to push legislators to do is to be learners, so that they understand that when they are writing laws, they're writing laws that are comprehensive enough, and that they're putting in place the structures, meaning starting with money, to support the thing that they're asking for. And so there really has to be an idea of learning. There has to be this notion that we start with teachers coming into the profession from an EPP, and that a state really does have leverage to decide whether they will certify a teacher coming from said college or university who doesn't know how to teach reading, but they're going into an elementary school. We can learn from the work that Louisiana did a number of years back by incentivizing districts to choose from a series of possible programs and curricula that will address the learning needs of students. And one thing I'm going to say, and push against our conversation here, is we need to rethink our language. When we talk about what happened with students when school buildings were closed, kids were learning. They weren't losing learning. What they were losing is school sanctioned types of learning. Kids came back to the education space with a bevy of knowledge. And what schools need to figure out how to do now is tap back into what kids came back into the building with, and how to attach all of that to what has to happen on a school side. And so by way of what should be in policies, I think Dr. Burke gave us the layout. And so what she provided really does set the stage for what it means for something to be comprehensive and thorough and thoughtful. But I do want to reiterate that we need our legislators to be thoughtful themselves. And we need our legislators to be learning about reading themselves. And then we have to decide that our mission, that this really is mission critical, and that you can say you want every kid in your state to learn how to read, but if a district in your state, like in California, are still using what is determined and verified and researched to be the kinds of curricula that doesn't get kids to engage in the work of reading, then is your mission really aligned? And so part of this is a calling out of mission alignment between what we say we want and what we provide districts the ability to purchase in order to evidence our beliefs. So if you're purchasing things like Wonders, and you're purchasing things like, the other ones that were mentioned, Benchmark, and you know that they are not high quality when it comes to teaching students the mechanics of learning how to read, then what's your mission? And so that's part of the conversation that we need to begin to have to talk about as well.
Dr. Marshall, thank you so much. And you are moving us right into our open panel discussion because there's so much great information already set here. And we're going to jump right into that. And picking up from where you really just left off, and for other voices, panelists to join in as well, and you've already given us the specific advice would you offer to policymakers in this moment, with regards to the science of reading. You've already talked about being learners as well. And so I want to continue to add to that conversation for any of our other panel members that want to jump in. Todd has something there to say, Dr. Burke jumping back in, or Patrick, I know you work with the legislature and folks across the country. Any other ideas or thoughts that you would like to offer at this moment with regards to the science of reading for policymakers?
I can try on this one. As you mentioned, I work with legislators every day, and I'm very lucky to do so. I will say, right now I'm sitting outside this room. There's about 100 legislators who are here learning about early learning, learning about youth homelessness, things like that. So I will say that I do think legislators are learners. They just have a lot they need to learn about. They cover so many different things. I think one thing that I've seen in the comments here today is continuing to try and define the science of reading. I know I think it is well defined for those of us who really will do the digging, but to think more about it from a policy lever standpoint, The legislators can't go in the classroom and teach phonics, but what they can do is think about licensing and regulations and talk about statewide curriculum standards, things like that. So I think maybe trying to translate some of it into that can be helpful. And I think one of the conversations we've had here today that I thought has been pretty impactful is just trying to get a sense with this multi-tiered, mixed delivery system that we have in almost every state. Is there a way to show where all the money is going? How can we better coordinate money? Legislators feel like there's so many different groups working in this space that are all receiving grants and funds, and they'd love to see a little bit more about outcomes and a little bit more about reducing redundancies and administrative staff, things like that. And I'm just repeating things I've heard directly from folks.
Perfect, thank you. Any other thoughts, perspective? Todd, go right ahead.
Just real quick, and I hesitate to say this when people like Hamiona Burke are on, who say it so much better than I do, but she mentioned the idea of a comprehensive reading approach at a state level. And, on listening to that long list of initiatives that Patrick read earlier, one of the things that struck me is, and one of the things that we've called out our California leadership for, is we've been putting patch after patch on a system that never actually worked. And so you'll never succeed by putting patches on a system that doesn't work. You need to step back and do what they did in Mississippi and in some other states and say, what is a comprehensive approach? Because this is not a one, you can't just do literacy coaches, and you can't just do curriculum, and you can't just do early phonics and expect to really move the needle on results. And I think legislators, if there's anything they need to understand that these patchwork approaches are not going to move the needle. They may feel good to be able to say, I appropriated money for this, or I initiated that. It sounds good, but it's not going to move the needle. It requires a system level problem. We need a system level change.
Todd, thank you very much. I think, Patrick said it well, that there's lots of information and things that our policymakers have to deal with, and lots of pressure points for them in this space. I think the recommendation here is being good learners and being a part of the collective in moving forward. I do have another question for this great panel, and it's back to legislators and leaders. How can they ensure, and someone spoke about that earlier, that teacher preparation programs also are doing their due diligence on their part for preparing our next generation of educators in the science of reading. Any specific thoughts there that you would like to share for participants?
I won't spend too much time, but there are plenty, as I mentioned, legislators that are having science of reading as part of your prep program be required for licensing. And so if you can't get licensed based on the program you're going to, you probably won't go to that program. So that's incentivizing the colleges to change. But then again, universities are unique in some states in terms of how much actual say the legislator or state has on curriculum going on. And so sometimes looking at licensing is the lever that they've gone to, but other states are putting together task force to work directly with their higher ed institutes to figure out a way forward and to vamp up the curriculum.
So go ahead, Dr. Burke.
Yeah, but I'll just add to that, I think that we're taking one thing for granted. We're really thinking that, we've had all of these candidates who've been produced from universities that may not be equipped to teach students, according to the science of reading. So we're thinking that if we put it in the legislation, and again, I always say legislation is a great first step, that it's going to automatically happen. But we have not addressed the fact that some of our faculty may not have been trained in the science of reading. So if we put in the legislation, and I've seen, North Carolina's a state that has faculty in there, Tennessee, I believe Connecticut, where we're addressing what should be taught in educator preparation programs now aligned to the science of reading. How do we ensure that our professors, our reading faculty, have this training themselves so that they can effectively teach our future teachers how to use this evidence-based approach? So I think that that's something that we really need to make sure that we are supporting our faculty in this shift as well, and not just automatically assuming that they know, because they may have been trained in balanced literacy or whole language. So I think that that's an area that we have to consider.
So Dr. Burke, it goes back to the concept of becoming learners across the system, but understand what is and what isn't, right? And where those points of connection needs to be critically important as we have these conversations everywhere. And it's not always a one size fits all. I think the context that we're working in also matters, really amplifies the need for this level of really rich conversation happening, across the board. I saw in the chat someone put in about our school boards also, and making sure that school boards, I know Todd, you represented the school board, are a part of that conversation as well. Other thoughts? Yeah, other thoughts on this before we move to another question, which is really related on, and I think somebody mentioned it earlier, how can leaders influence districts that may have local control in this space to use curricula that are rooted in the science of reading? And we know policy is one way to do that, but any other thoughts or examples of what you've seen work in trying to make sure that districts are encouraged to use curricula that's rooted in the science of reading? Todd, go right ahead.
Yeah, this is close, as you mentioned, Charlene, this is close to my heart because I am a local school board member, and we have gone through that exact process at my district, examining and ultimately changing the way we teach reading here. I think it's incredibly important because, even if you have a state level policy, as we said before, the policy is only as good as its implementation. And if you don't have a state level policy, as many states don't, including mine, it is the main thing that we do in places like California to try to improve results for reading. So I really urge parents to go to your superintendent and school board, which in most places are your elected officials. And you'll be shocked to find out that the vast majority of them don't really understand what's going on with reading in their district. Just showing, I personally brought third grade reading results to my superintendent and showed them the subgroup breakout that showed that our low income students in Palo Alto, 80% were below grade level in reading. And it wasn't news that there was a achievement gap in Palo Alto. It wasn't news that we didn't necessarily do a great job, but to show that 80% of students were below grade level, which by the way, put us in the bottom 5% of all school districts in California for teaching low income Latino students, was a real shock to the system. And I think once that realization sets in, it's hard to look away. And I think you'll find that most school board members and most superintendents actually want to try to improve things. They just don't know which levers to pull. So I think you can really help educate your district and educate your district leadership that this is an opportunity for them to address a core equity problem in your district and help them serve the students that they, frankly, this is why they went into this business, right? Is to help serve those kind of students. I think Tanji has something to add.
Yeah, I was actually going to add on to what Todd said about the idea of using data. So data is always a critical lever. When we talk about groups of students, we talk about where we slot students and where we name students, and also helping community members ask critical questions. And one very critical question they can ask is, how are we teaching our students in this district how to read? And if they can't name specifically how they're doing it, maybe there's a push-in point there. Teaching our community how to do things like ask questions around the curriculum. Does the curriculum we have offer our educators the best opportunity to support our students as they learn how to read? A lot of times you hear educators talk about, we want our kids to learn to love reading. Well, you can't love what you don't know how to do. So we need to help students understand that there is a how, and some critical questions can really help our community partners partner with us and join with us to understand that there is a mechanics to this thing called reading, and then how do we get them to do that?
Can I add something to that too? I think a really important element in all of this that is pushing the needle here is the important recognition that most kids need help learning how to read. There has been this idea that some kids need help. But most kids, if you talk to them a lot and you read to them a lot and you give them some good guidance and you put them in a guided reading group, they'll be fine. And I think it's very important to recognize in a place like Palo Alto, for example, that Todd has identified how poorly that district is doing with kids from low-income families. But the truth is that in a place like Palo Alto, there are plenty of kids from high-income families who are having a hard time learning how to read, and their parents are taking care of the problem, often to the tune of hundreds of dollars an hour for tutors. And it's very commonplace. So the actual problem when schools don't teach reading gets masked by family affluence. So affluent families can take care of the problem. Many people know that their child has a problem, but it gets privatized for some people, and then we don't see them. Even though our problem is huge, the magnitude of this is huge, I would argue that we're not even seeing the full magnitude of the problem because some of it is being dealt with by the families.
Yeah, and just to add on, I put it in the chat. Listen very carefully to the word that Emily said. Some children in this country, and we have to be very, very willing to name the truth. And the truth is, in this country, we are okay with some kids not learning how to read because this has been how it's been. And so what Emily's work did was open the door for us to really name the fact that some means most. That most kids are struggling because reading is hard. Our brains are not hardwired for reading like they are for the other senses. And so there's a lot of brain work that has to happen in order for a child or a person to acquire the skill. And so we have, if you look at the way we fund education, looking at the way at how we distribute students and their families in neighborhoods and towns that are funded or underfunded, we are funding the actual outcomes we've gotten. It is very easy to name this as a quote unquote COVID pandemic issue. This happened in 2012, 2017, all the long-term data. So we've got to be willing to say this is the data now is just showing what we have been putting our money towards for decades in this country. And right now, because the sum has turned into the most and the many, now we're willing to have a conversation about how to stop the flood of students who are having difficulty learning how to read. Because now the kids who are really struggling to learn how to read are the kids who aren't supposed to. And so I'm just going to say that. And
I will add to that is, I will add to that as well. I mean, one argument, 8 in 10 Black fourth graders are reading at basic or below. And I have made the argument for a long time that if 8 in 10 white children were reading at basic or below, I think would be at a different place. And yet, as my editor was just pointing out to me yesterday, a lot of people don't realize that about half of white children are in that situation. So we still, it's a problem that just is gigantic, and it has had much bigger impact on some kids than others, but it's having a big impact on a lot of kids. So we really have to recognize that.
As you can hear from our panelists here, are really important information and really passionate about the work that is so important. And this is a call for urgency, right? This is a sense of urgency. Dr. Burke earlier talked about, think tank and do tank, right? It is time to move forward here from policy to action, or what I like to say, sometimes we admire the problem versus really working very hard. And these are not always easy solutions to make sure that we're working together. So it really is important to be having these conversations, as you can hear, and really important. And I'll go back to what I said before about looking at even your local data. And that's why we're so pleased to have a really great, I talked about, that we launched the COVID recovery dashboard, where you can go in and families can go in and use it and communities can go in and use it. And you can look at a school, you can disaggregate the data, based on the different student populations. So we can have this information and everybody can be a part of the solution. So, thank you very much. As we wrap up our panel today and prepare to open up to question and answer time, I just really wanted to give our panelists like a last minute or so if there's any really key things that you'd like to add in here, even as you've been looking at the chat. before we move on to taking our question from our audience? Anything that you would like to add before we move on into the audience? All right, hearing nothing else from our panelists. I know they've got a lot to say, but we'll go into our questions. We'll take a limited number of questions from our audience, and we'll take those questions, ask our panelists to jump in here as well as the time allows. And please note that we will post an evaluation poll with 7 to 10 minutes remaining in the webinar. This is not intended to stop the conversation, but to provide the audience time to respond if you have to leave a little bit early, and we want to make sure we have that. So why don't we just go through that and begin to look at some questions. One of the things that we have here, there's a question from Alan. Many college teacher programs are not teaching the science of reading. We've talked about that. They are maybe doing theory. Do you agree? And if so, how can these be addressed? I think we talked a little bit about that, but would anyone else want to add just anything further about our teacher preparation programs and the need for us to partner with them as well? I know Dr. Burke talked about it before, also Dr. Marshall.
I think we can go back to what Dr. Burke said when she said we are making assumptions around what college and school of education professors know, and thinking about how long has it been since a college professor in the School of Education has engaged in the work that they do, in terms of what's the distance, what's the average number of years of teaching, right? And so also thinking about, someone said that they are doing research, but what the question is, are they researching implementation, as Dr. Burke has talked about? Like doing research to sort of uncover is great, but the implementation so that we get to these ideas of contextualized best practices. We love best practices, but best practices tend to be decontextualized and they tend to be retrofitted. So if something is going well in one state, another state will just simply adopt it and move it forward. But if it doesn't work in their state, they may not have understood why. So this idea of researching in context to get a deep understanding of how the mechanisms work, and then really putting together the kind of research that involves the community of learners. So it involves your college professors, it involves your SEAs, it involves your LEAs from a participatory action perspective, so you get a wide lens of information regarding the research that you're trying to understand and the questions you want to ask.
So thank you so much, Dr. Marshall. There is also really two great questions, and we talked about that earlier. Two good questions here about how do we support families, parents, and caregivers in applying the science of reading. And if you notice that your students are not on track, number one, how do you know it? And what do you do to help to support your children?
Can I say something here?
Sure, sure.
I think a lot of parents don't know that their kids are behind in reading. And that is, and I think this hasn't been talked about enough, but it is very, very common in schools, especially in K-1-2, for the primary, and in some cases only assessment to be what book level your child is on. And unfortunately, that really tells you very little about how well a child is doing with the specific skills that will add up to skilled reading by the end of third grade, which is what we want all kids to be. So I think there are a lot of, and I've just interviewed so many parents who had no idea. And then they start to get hints. They go to the school says everything's fine because she's on the right level. And the parent says, I think something's not right here. And then the problem doesn't really get identified until second grade, third grade, fourth grade, ninth grade. And then it's really a problem because this is a very exponential situation. Reading skill is something that builds on itself. And we're talking here about the importance of getting young children at the age of 5, 6, and 7 years old off to a good start so that they don't fall behind early. Because what happens is the kids who get off to a good start going like this, and the kids who are struggling just kind of limp along. And then there's this huge thing, and this is this thing we call the achievement gap, and that's it. And it starts when kids are in first grade or before and before.
Thank you, Emily. Other thoughts about supporting, I'm thinking about Dr. Burke, maybe initiatives that you've seen in other states, specifically supporting families in this space and caregivers.
Yes, Tennessee passed 2 laws last year, their Literacy Success Act and also their Learning Loss and Remediation Act. With that, they put about $140 million into all of the supports around implementing those components of the laws. One of them includes an app and resources for parents, and that initiative is called Reading 360. So you can learn more about that initiative and those supports that Tennessee is providing to parents through that. And, you know, although other states may have read by 3 laws, so many times these laws begin in kindergarten, and they don't necessarily address or support students as they are, you know, in, 4-year-olds. Mississippi did pass, at the same time that we passed our Literacy-Based Promotion Act, we passed our Early Learning Collaborative Act, which was our state's first state investment into supporting 4-year-olds in pre-K. With this Early Learning Collaborative Act, school district or a school within a school district will partner with a Head Start child care center, and they will commit to this model, the same model that we're using in K-3, where they have professional development for their teachers. They are choosing the curricula that is to be implemented. And the goal is to ensure that these students are prepared to enter K. Now, we have a law for that. You don't have to have a law for that. If you're in a community and you know that in your school that there are all of these students that come from a particular Head Start or from a particular child care center, it only benefits you as the teacher, as the school administrator, to ensure that those teachers also have access to professional development, if there's a way that you can partner to do that. One thing I'll say about our data is that one thing that it has proven is that our students take a kindergarten readiness assessment pre and post. Our students who are in those early learning collaboratives with that intentional focus on early literacy and readiness outperform our students who are in regular public school pre-K that are funded by Title I, and of course, students who are in Head Start and definitely those students who are coming from home. So that type of model where you're partnering with the schools, with the Head Start and with the other child care agencies can sometimes ensure that students are ready.
Thank you for that information as well. Further questions, and I know there was a question on definition, and Emily has put a link in the chat for us, but any other thoughts there? While I've got you, Dr. Burke, you're centered on my screen, and all the work that you've done around, I think there's some questions about definitions, and whether you wanted to say anything about that as well.
Well, I was actually, the link that Emily put into the chat is that link of the coalition that was really led by the Reading League. And our goal was to define the science of reading as best we could. It's called the Defining Movement. And you can Google it or search it. I think it's maybe at the whatisthescienceofreading.com or .org. And it's also maybe on the Reading League's site. And if you look to see who's on that list of members for the coalition, it includes Louisa Moats. It includes, others who are really giants in the field of literacy and reading, and really wanted to be inclusive of all of the different research that we found out about over the years, and also give ways in which we have learned that children learn. So it's you can download the Science of Reading Defining Guide from that website as well.
Yeah, and you do have to download it. I think it's like 45 pages long or something like that. It's a big read. And so there is a short little definition on the website, but there's a much longer guide. And I think it's really important, not that that's the definitive answer. I think this is a really important part of how we ended up in the situation we're in today, because I think that different ideas of research and science and what science is have played a very, very pivotal role in how some of this stuff has been kind of kept out of schools. There's sort of been an idea it's sort of a little bit of a turf war, kind of, but there's sort of been an idea that educators and education researchers and certain sort of literacy experts have thought about this one way. And then cognitive scientists and neuroscientists and educational psychologists and speech language pathologists and other kinds of researchers who often aren't in schools of education. They're in other departments. They're across the quad on the university. What really happened is in the 1970s, there was sort of a definition of reading that was coming out of education and schools of education. I'm speaking in very broad strokes here. And then there was another kind of set of people who were cognitive scientists mostly and psychologists who got kind of intrigued by, how do we read? How does our brain do that? How do we remember all those words? What is up with that? And they started investigating in little experiments and figuring some things out. And they started having new tools, brain scans, and all those kinds of things that started to help them reveal the mystery of the human mind. Literally this thing that for hundreds, thousands of years, we didn't understand how skilled reading works. And now we really understand a whole lot of it. Like over the past 40, 50 years, a lot of this stuff got figured out. And it's just that education was doing something kind of different. And the problem is that some of what the cognitive scientists figured out conflicted with what a lot of people deeply believed about reading and how it should be taught. And that's where we got the war. And everyone thinks in the simplified way that it was about phonics, but it was really more about two different kinds of fields and ways of understanding things, different kinds of research, research where you're in labs looking at brains or where you're taking huge samples of student data versus very important research that was much more focused on observing closely small groups of children and trying to understand something about how a reading works from doing that. And it's really been a big battle about that that's starting to come to an head. And I think what's happening right now is just understanding that there's overwhelming evidence from the sort of cognitive science side of this that needs to be informing educational practice differently and better, and it's relevant. There is stuff from this science that is relevant to education. And I think people kind of got away with for a long time to say, that's not relevant. You guys are the scientists over here. We're the teachers over here. But these fields need to be talking to each other. And it's the same way. The scientists don't understand teaching. They don't understand the dynamics of schooling and education and teachers' lives and how complicated it is and the craziness of professional development and how it doesn't work so much at the time. There's so much stuff that the scientists don't understand. So everyone needs to be talking to each other. And I think it's starting to happen. I think more and more of those conversations are happening, and it's causing some friction in some cases, but I think it will ultimately, hopefully, lead to a better good.
No, thank you.
Children, this is about children.
About children, no, absolutely. And I know Dr. Marshall is going to jump in here as well. And while you're giving that added context, Dr. Marshall, I know there's also questions about how do you understand the needs of the community, right? Back to that conversation. So go right ahead.
Yeah, so number one, it is about the children. It's supposed to be about Johnny and Susie and all the other kids learning how to do the thing we call reading. It is a thing, it has a process. So this idea, like, so for instance, I'm a triathlete, right? That means I swim, I bike, and I run. Just putting me in the water, hoping I can figure out that whole swimming thing doesn't make me a swimmer. I need someone who's going to show me the mechanics of doing that thing called swimming so I don't drown, right? So that's that. And Emily's right. Schooling, the process of schooling is complicated. In our country, everyone goes to school, so we all think we know what it's like because we all did it. When we did it on the user side, we didn't do it on the prep side. And that's a very different thing. Talking about communities, number one, you have to respect the community you're trying to be in partnership with. You have to take a participatory action, partnership perspective and stance when you're trying to work with a community. It is not anyone's job to go into a community and decide what that community needs. Many, many years ago, National Geographic came out with an apology because they realized what they were doing to indigenous communities was voyeurism and capitalistic. Well, we tend to take that particular stance with communities, particularly those of color, those who have been economically marginalized in our country. If you want to know what a community needs, you got to go spend time in the community and ask them what they need. And don't assume that you know what they need because what's working in your community, you think is the best thing since sliced bread and cheese. Well, it may not be the best thing since sliced bread in a new community. So you've got to really decide that every community is different, and that you really respect the people who live there. And you want to take a learning perspective. So you want to go in and you want to learn first. You want to understand that community first, and then you want to work to be understood, work to be understood. And so that's really the important piece of working with the community, to really learn and to really come in with the perspective of respect, which is really, really huge. And I heard someone had a question about curriculum. Curriculum, the materials within a curriculum are as good as the adult delivering them. But there is a baseline that your curriculum really must provide, just like a law, the conditions to create the kind of learning we say we want kids to engage in. And so that comes with a comprehensive curriculum that is centered around helping the educator understand the mechanics of the thing we call reading. So if science is making you angry, don't say the word science and say the mechanics of reading, right? Something else. And then what are the support systems an educator needs in order to deliver? What are the support systems necessary for assessment? How often do we assess? What are we assessing? How do we go back and have conferences with kids and with parents and with our schools so we can really begin to dig in and understand where we are regarding who knows how to read, how well they know how to read, and who else needs support?
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. Underscoring really the concept here of working together and not making assumptions. And the concept is not about them without them, is what I would like to always like to say. And so that everybody becomes a part of that conversation and providing the supports necessary. I'll just share one thing that we've just done here recently in our state, collaborating with experts and stakeholders, and specifically our school superintendent organization, investing some of our COVID relief dollars, that everyone looking at how we spend those, $6 million to launch the Science of Reading Masterclass. And what that masterclass is, includes statewide professional learning and coaching to district teams to support this comprehensive K-3 literacy instruction. But what we learned was, it's not just good enough to say, let's come and get a one-day sit and get, but then you also go back, we talk about implementation and the need to have coaches or folks there to help you make sure you're implementing what it is that you are learning. And so again, so important, but we're talking broadly about a community being a part of the conversations, understanding what is, makes our educators or families, it's everyone working together, which is really so important. So thank you for that. I know that there are other questions that some of our panelists are also looking at here. They're really great questions. And so, here's a question from Mandy about the teacher shortage and how is that impacting successful implementation of policies, I think in general, and specifically quality of reading programs. And Patrick, again, I don't know if you're looking out to see some of those things that's happening there. This issue of oral shortages is not one, it is a nationwide issue that I know a lot of states are dealing with. And I'll come back to talk about the Department of Education's role, because I think either Dr. Marshall or Dr. Burke brought that up as well, which is really important. So thoughts about the teacher shortage, what you're seeing out there, and your thoughts about impact. All right, I'll go to Patrick.
Go ahead. Patrick, go ahead.
Sure, no, just only because you mentioned it. It's not something that I've tracked too specifically legislation-wise, but I can say it's something that every legislator is thinking about. And so they are pretty much front of mind on that in the moment. And some of these other things may feel a little more back burner if they're worried about having enough teachers to start the year at the moment. So that's just the perspective I can bring.
Sure, thanks.
I just wanted to add Sorry, I mean, I think, we have really high teacher turnover in this country, and this is a problem when it comes to school districts who are now investing in a lot of professional development for teachers. In some school districts, half those teachers aren't going to be there in 5 years. And so this is a really important thing to consider. I think one of the reasons that we're in the mess that we're in right now in the United States with reading instruction is the same reason that getting out of it is going to be difficult, because we just don't generally have a strong and robust enough teacher training system. So one of the reasons why some of these sort of shortcut ways to teach kids to read have become popular, I think, is because a lot of teachers just haven't gotten the good training that they needed in the English language and how written English works. You can be very good at reading and writing written English. It's very different to know how to teach that to a young child. And English is a complicated language. We're in this pickle in part because to teach a child to read and write English is actually more complex than teaching a child to read and write Spanish or German, or a language that is more orthographically direct, where the sounds of the letters connect almost always in the same way to the words, right? So you can teach them the system and they can figure it out. And English is complicated. And there are people out there who will tell you the solution to this is to change written English. And I think that's probably insane, because changing written English would be way too complicated. But it is true that there is quite a task before us, and a whole lot of people who got into teaching first and second grade didn't necessarily think that they were going to have to master the complexity of written English and understand the cognitive science of how our brains learn to read. So we have to recognize that we're kind of suddenly delivering, like, being a first grade teacher is maybe a little bit of a different proposition than you thought it was. And that's a big deal.
So Emily, hence the need for, we talk about this overall system of support that is not excluding anyone at this point in time. When you talk about those who are currently in the field, those who are coming in the field, right? What you're talking about here is the need for us to figure out systems that really work. I go back to the interlocking gears on Dr. Burt's presentation, the need for us to have those really systems in place, because if not, if you just look at, those coming in and then you're not looking at those who they're in or when they leave, it really is important for us to be thinking holistically.
I mean, this problem has gotten to the way it is because there haven't been systems, but as Todd pointed out, very interestingly, even though we haven't really had a system, if you look around, a lot of schools are teaching reading in sort of the same way without us having a system that was supposed to produce that. We're supposed to be a nation of like local control. And it's actually kind of shocking when you realize how consistent it is. Schools all over the country are using the leveled readers and the same kinds of assessments and the same kinds of strategies. And that's kind of amazing in a country where where our problem is supposed to be that everyone does something differently and 1,000 flowers bloom. It turns out that 1,000 flowers didn't bloom. We actually have a way of teaching reading, and it just doesn't line up very well with what the scientific research has shown us.
And I think I can say something we do very well in education is that we look to see what's going on around us. And because why reinvent the wheel if something is working somewhere else? And so we tend to, to look for that around us.
Everybody does that. And it gets to the very important problem that I said about a place like Todd's, where be careful when you say you think it's working somewhere. What is working? Why is it working? Cause and effect is a very hard thing to figure out in education always. And this problem is getting masked in a lot of our places where the test scores are good. There's a lot of other stuff going on, and everyone should check the test scores again because they're not as good as you think they are.
Charlene, can I just add, because Emily's made that point a couple of times, I just want to underscore it because I think it's so important. That is something that we found, I live in an affluent district, and there are a lot of parents here who care about education. There's no doubt that we have very high aggregate test scores in my district, very high. There is no doubt in my mind that what creates that very high effect is not that our schools are so incomparably great. We have very nice schools, very well funded, but what really is making, undergirds all our success is that we have families that are determined that their children are not going to fail, and they have the resources to make that determination real. And so, it's very so when we look at and say, hey, affluent, it's not that affluent kids are smarter than other kids. It's not that affluent kids can read better than other kids. And people reach into things like, everything from prenatal vitamins to birth weight and all kinds of, or the 30 million words and that kind of research. What's really going on is those kids are being taught to read at home. They're getting the background knowledge that they need to read at home. And so they just have, the amount of educational input those kids have is far in excess of what kids that don't have the same resources or educational attainment at home are able to receive. And like Emily said, if we don't acknowledge that and kind of look at the data through that lens, then we're not going to really understand what's going on. And I think that's, that was key to my thinking. And that's why I do what I do, is the realization that this isn't just about those kids. This is about all kids and a system that isn't working.
Thank you, Todd. And I know the poll is up, but we're going to keep moving here. At first, Dr. Marshall, I thought I saw you came on here for a minute, so I figured.
No, Dr. Burke and Dr. Burke and Patrick were up, so I didn't want to interrupt them. But what I was saying, I put it in the chat. We have to be very careful about how we name who cares and who doesn't care. Families in every community care about the education of their children. They all care. They all care. But as Todd pointed out, we are talking about resource differentials. We're talking about access differentials. We're talking about a systematic approach to underfunding school systems based upon the population. And we have to be willing to name that. And so in a place like Palo Alto, or in a place like parts of Manhattan, right? Parts of Manhattan, they call New York City urban. Well, urban by some people's characterization equals poor, Black, and brown. Well, not every part of Manhattan or the urban New York City is poor, Black, and brown. And so our language really carries a lot of weight. And so talking about, the availability and who cares and the access, we have to name underfunding as a critical access. We have to name systematic defunding and underfunding of neighborhoods. So you want to talk about what should be in a plan, in a legislative plan, let them go back and look at their funding. Let them go back and look at not just the funding for literacy, the funding for the educational systems across their state writ large. So if we're in the smallest state, Delaware, what is their funding like? Largest state, Texas, what's their funding like in every single district, in every single part of that state? Is it equitably laid out so that the access is equal to all, and that everybody, all the kids have the access to what they need? Parents may not know that they need to read to their students and talk to their kids. Okay, fine. But when they go to school, there's a thing that happens in school called teaching and learning that's supposed to happen. So when they get to school, they should have the confidence. See, part of the issue is families who are wealthier, they don't worry about confidence. They don't worry about having confidence in their school because they know that they can supplement. Other families don't have the resources to supplement. So they are scrambling and they are trusting their school district to educate their children. And they don't realize the impact of ongoing systematic underfunding and defunding.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So well stated in terms of kind of wrapping things up for us today. I know that there'll be additional webinars on this topic that you'll hear some more about before we close out, but it's so important. What you hear today, again, not simple solutions that we're talking about, but the one thing that's underscored is the need for the learning and the need for working together, which is so important. Dr. Burke talked about the role of the interlocking gears that I keep talking about, that the role of higher education, the role of our State Department of Education. I represent our State Department of Education here in Connecticut, and being able to lead the discussions that I saw so critical and timely across all systems, and that I'm sure that my counterparts across the country are doing as well, because this is a moment that we cannot lose. We have the last thing I'll share is that we have some new legislation. So I know Patrick didn't put those out there, but interstate as well, new legislation in Connecticut that establishes the Center for Literacy Research and Reading Success at our department, and also a separate Office of Dyslexia and Reading Disabilities. Continues to be a work in progress here for us. I want to move it as much as we can so we can get those. It deepens our commitment to evidence-based reading aligned with the science of reading, and expands the support that's so important for our students, for our districts, and really for the families and the whole community writ large to be a part of this discussion. So I encourage to continue this conversation in further webinars that I know will be happening, and not fail to remember as we talk today about the science of reading, that there are also other data points and information that are not disconnected. We've got to make sure students are in school every day and engaged in learning. Being in attendance matters. And so I know the grade level reading campaign talks a lot about our attendance issues. So there are others, making sure that our students and our staff, their social, emotional, mental, physical health needs are also addressed, are all the things that we continue to talk about. But I really just want to thank all the panelists here today for the passion brought here, the knowledge base, the expertise that we're hoping that all our participants were able to avail yourselves of today. Thank you. I so value being able to just sit and listen to all of our panelists today and to be a part of this. With that, I'm turning things back to Hilary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlene, as well, and for all of our panelists for the time that you've spent today and shared so much with us about what's occurring in various states and across this country. As we've said a couple of times today, this webinar is the first in a series of discussions around the science of reading, and we will continue to explore what we're seeing as states, as districts, principals, educators, as we move towards implementing the science of reading. And so I know there were many, many questions that we did not answer today, or maybe did not answer as fully as you would have liked to hear. And be sure that if you stay engaged with the campaign for grade level reading, that we will work to answer some of those questions. Please also consider registering for one of our upcoming Learning Tuesday webinars. We have a conversation on re-envisioning school staffing, as well as on September 20th, parent-teacher home visits and the power of trusting relationships, as well as deepening school community collaboration to support children and families with First 10 Partnerships in Action. So just keep an eye for those events coming up over the next month. Please take a moment, fill out our survey if you haven't done that already. And we want to thank you all for your time, our presenters, our moderator. It was a wonderful conversation to just be able to listen to and hear all that you're thinking about.